So before we jump into content, I did want to go over a couple of technical details. Most of you are probably listening on your computers, but if you have any issues with the audio, you can also call in by telephone number, and the call-in number is there on the screen. If you have questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to submit them using the question box on the control panel. We'll be doing all of the questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to go ahead and send them our way at any point as you think of them, and then we'll make sure that we get to as many as possible in the last part of this morning's presentation. Finally, I want to let everybody know that the PowerPoint slides that we're using today, as well as a recording of this morning's web seminar, will be posted on our website, which is listed there, cacollegepathways.org. We also will send out a copy of the PowerPoint slides to everybody who's participating in this morning's web seminar. Next slide, please. So before we turn it over to our primary speaker this morning, I wanted to give a little bit of a very brief refresher from a web seminar that we did last month that was kind of the precursor to this webinar about how you actually get data. So this morning we're going to be talking about using the data that you get, but for those of you who didn't have a chance to listen to the first web seminar we did, I'm going to give just a 2-minute refresher course on that. And I will say that the slides, along with all of the materials that are referenced in that web seminar and the recording of the web seminar, are on our website at the website indicated there, the collegepathways.org/data resources. So you can get all of this information at our website. So in terms of how one actually gets the data that we're going to be talking about this morning, if you're a community college, there's now a report that's available through the CalPass Plus system that community colleges can work with their institutional research departments to access. For four-year universities who do participate in CalPass Plus, those campuses can also pull this report by providing a cohort file, a list of all the foster youth directly to CalPass Plus, and then they can pull all kinds of data such as GPA, retention, graduation rates, etc. If a four-year university does not participate in CalPass Plus, then that university would have to work with their individual campus institutional research department in order to generate the data from their own internal MIS system. And so this is just a sort of brief look at how the data can actually be accessed by campuses. And again, there's a lot more detail about what is CalPass Plus and what are the data elements that are now available and how do you go about pulling the data through CalPass Plus and what are the considerations for working with your institutional research department. All of that information was covered in the web seminar we did last month. And so once you listen to today's web seminar and you're super excited about being able to use the data, you can go back and listen to that in order to get more information about how to actually get to that data. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Booth, who is with us today from West Ed. And Kathy has a tremendous amount of expertise in the issue of working with data, as well as working with data in the context of college systems. So we're incredibly thankful and appreciative for her participation in today's web seminar. With that, I will turn it over to Kathy.
Thanks, Debbie. You can go ahead and advance the slide. One note, because I looked at the people who had signed up for this webinar, and I noticed that we had people from other states. So one of the things I want to point out is that while we'll be talking a lot about data that are available in California, most of the kinds of metrics that we're talking about are collected by other colleges in other states. And also for those of you who are working in social service agencies, you could partner with your educational institutions, whether they're K-12 districts or colleges, to look at similar metrics, because these are the kinds of things that most educators are trying to track. So today's session is going to be divided into 3 distinct parts. So the first part is sort of making the case for the use of data. And we all know that data are all the rage right now. But sort of the big question in your mind may be, why is this actually a good thing for us as practitioners, service providers, educators who are really working with foster youth? So I'm going to talk you through some of the things that you're going to benefit from now that we have more access to information. Having done that, we're going to move on and take a look at some specific examples of the kinds of data you could look at and what you could actually do with this information. So we can move out of the realm of the theoretical and really think about specific scenarios that you might be able to implement, right away. And finally, I just wanted to give you some tips for working with data, just some things that we've learned looking across many different initiatives that have tried to use data as a leverage tool to get people to work on often large systems change. And there's just a number of things we've learned that I wanted to share with you. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. So one of the things that I want to talk about related to why there's a focus on data and what it means is that I'm actually tremendously excited that we are now looking much more at outcomes than we do at activities. And that's because it really puts the focus back on the student or the foster youth or your client, basically understanding not just what is it that we're doing, like how many counseling sessions are we holding or how many FAFSA applications can we get people to fill out, but really looking at what that ends up meaning for the people that we're trying to serve. And this really also allows us to be looking more at the pipeline that students go through, not just the narrow window of when we get to interact with them, but understanding how all of our activities together add up to the ability of these young people to be able to make a better lives for themselves. I think that the second bullet point really speaks to that question then of what you all probably want to know. So all of us are motivated when a student comes back or a client comes back and says, what you did for me made a world of difference, and I was able to, get myself on my feet and get an apartment and get the things that I need to be successful in my life. But it's so much more powerful when you're not relying on individual stories, but you can actually look at what happens to a large number of individuals, and you can understand how what you might be doing early in that student's education career ends up impacting what happens when they actually get to their career in the workplace. And so when we're looking at these systems together, you might have ideas for ways that you can be more effective or understand if there's things that you are doing that are tremendously effective that you can do more of. And finally, there's been this real impact that all of us have felt, which is the funding reductions that's happening both on the educational side and on the social services side. And one of the byproducts of this is this focus on return on investments. We hear a lot about ROI. And this can feel very cold and calculating because it becomes this issue of how can you quantify a success and is something really worth it or not? And a lot of us know that the difference that we make often doesn't feel like it's easily reducible to a number. But there's another way to look at return on investment, and it has to do with your ability to deliver these services. So it may be that there is something that you have thrown yourself into heart and soul, you're working nights and weekends, and without access to data, you may not know whether it's working or not. So the last thing you want to be doing is sinking all of your considerable energy into something that's not yielding a strong return for students. Or if there's something you're doing that is tremendously successful, that might not even require that level of effort to accomplish, then that might be a place where you want to put your limited time and energy to make the biggest difference for foster youth. So when we talk about data, you'll notice that I'm going to be doing a lot of things to turn, I think, the way we think about data on its head, rather than looking at it as a weapon that's used to punish people who don't get enough done, to really look at how we can use it as a tool to be as effective as possible for the people we're trying to serve. So next slide, please. So one of the ways that I really want to sort of focus on this issue of what it really means to work with data is to be really clear that I'm not saying that it's like you can just sit down at your computer and press a button and then all of a sudden you're going to have the answer right there. Most answers are not readily reducible to numbers. It's not as if you can look at a dashboard and say, my gosh, that's what's wrong, and just know what to do. And in fact, one of the things, if you talk to researchers, you'll notice that we tend to be people who have a lot of questions. So if you look at the way any research paper is constructed, there'll be the list of the question that's asked and how that person went around trying to answer that question, what they learned, and then there'll be a huge portion of their paper that'll be about all the other questions that the research raised. So really, I think data is the doorway to inquiry, because what happens is that you start with that quantitative number, and that's going to have you realize that there's other things that you need to understand, and the way you're going to get to that deeper understanding is usually not through numbers alone. So you'll move from the realm of the quantitative of those numbers to the qualitative. And this is a place where you may be very comfortable and very experienced. So I've listed some of the ways that you can gather data, and I really want to emphasize here that data is this more comprehensive set of resources, set of information that you can use to understand what's happening to your students. So this first one, I like to say faculty are just such effective researchers because they spend most of their days with these embedded assessments that they're using to figure out whether students are learning the content or not. So you might start from a quantitative number and then realize there's more information you need to gather in the classroom or that you've already gathered that you could look at to better understand what's going on. Some of the other tools that you might want to look at using are things like going directly to students, whether you're interviewing them or you're doing focus groups with a group of students or you're sending out a survey. That can give you a lot of information that will rapidly move you from having a question to having some possible answers. One of the things I also want to point out is that previously, when we've been measuring things in academic or educational contexts, we've usually been looking at this idea of course successes. Did you master the content? And one of the things that I'm sure anyone working with foster youth knows it really, really well is that there's a lot more to whether students succeed besides like whether they know their quadratic equation. If they believe that they don't have any business being in a math class, if they've been taught that they're just no good at math, they're not going to be able to gain that content. So it might be really important for you to be looking at affective, non-cognitive factors as well as the content of what's being taught. And finally, one of the other really important places to gather data is to talk to other people who are working with similar problems. And you can start saying to someone, hey, I'm seeing this issue and I'm working on it this way, and this is the outcome I'm getting. What's happening when you're working on this issue? And you can take that information as a data point that you can use to inform your own decision making. So go on to the next slide. So with that view of data analysis in mind, which is much more expansive, I want to be really clear about what it's like when you're going to approach working with data this way. And the first thing, as I've already mentioned, is that this is a tremendously messy process. That when you start with data analysis, you're going to end up with more questions than you began with. But that's a good thing, because that's how you start to drive the inquiry process, where you start digging in and really getting to answers. The second thing I want to point out is that it's flawed, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand that the issue of data accuracy is going to have everything to do with data usability. So you know the old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. One of our problems is that the way data has been gathered, particularly in educational settings, often is looking towards the end of the line. So did all the students get a degree or not? And when that data gets collected, it is often held up by administrators, and it doesn't get down to faculty or directors or teachers who are really in there doing the work with the students. So if data get coded, so we assign a category to a bit of information, and it goes up into those big systems that roll up toward the long-term goals, and then it never gets shared back with the folks who are actually working with foster youth. They have no idea whether that information is correct or not, and a simple coding error can have an enormous impact on what that data actually looks like. So one of the things that's going to be, I think, very characteristic of this era, where we're finally able to gather a lot of information and put it back in the hands of practitioners, is that we're going to spend a while doing data cleanup. And that's a very important and worthwhile activity. So just be ready for that. And that doesn't mean that it isn't worth doing. It actually makes it all the more worth doing. The next thing I want to just say is that it's sobering. And I don't think we should be sugarcoating that case, because when you start to look at the numbers, especially when you're looking at disaggregated information, when you're seeing outcomes for particularly Latino and African American students, even worse with Latino and African American men, even worse when you put foster youth on top of that, is that you'll see how few students are making it through. But I don't want us to get stuck there, because seeing the magnitude of the problem can actually be something that you can use as a resource, and I'll talk more about that later. And this can lead to this final point where it can actually be really exciting. So after the shock of seeing just how bad it is, which probably won't be surprising because you all have been working in this field for a while, and you know what happens to people. You know, you hear the stories that come back. It can give you a chance to really renew your passion for your work. It can give you a chance to say, okay, so if this is the problem we're dealing with, what am I going to do about it to make a difference? So let's go on to the next slide. And this is where I want to talk about sort of what it is that you can gain that makes it exciting. So one of the first things that I've seen when you really put data in the hands of practitioners is that it's a powerful tool for reducing isolation. And this is really true in academic institutions where you sort of get the kingdom of the classroom or the kingdom of the counseling office. So people might be there, you know, working their hardest to make a difference for foster youth or for all of their students, but they're very much alone, and they don't necessarily know who else in their college is also really passionate about this and working to make a difference, or they might be working diligently away in their classroom and not have a lot of access to counseling staff that have an equally important impact on those young people. So one of the things that you can do is that you can start using shared data as a way to get people together across classrooms, across divisions. And even more exciting, particularly for foster youth, you can start moving outside the walls of your institution. So you can reach back to your K-12 partners, you can reach forward to your four-year partners if you're at a community college, and you can definitely reach out into the community for service providers. And together, you can look at this information and figure out what it means for how you can be more effective working together and how you can pool your expertise and your passion for making a difference. The second thing that's going to be really helpful about looking at your data is you're going to get a lot more insight into what's standing in the way of success, but also what it is you're doing that's really working. And we can focus, it's very easy to focus on the negative, but there's a lot of positive things that you're likely to see once you start looking at your data. So you're going to be able to be more effective at your planning because you're going to understand what's happening to your students as a result of the interventions that you've designed. And the final thing that I think is really important about access to data is that it can just give you incredible bargaining power, because you can move from a position of having a number of compelling anecdotes to having some really powerful statements that you can make about the number of students who are not making it, or a program that is tremendously successful in changing those odds for students. And you're going to be in a better position to ask for policy changes, whether that's how students go about filling out their financial aid forms, or getting access to resources like money and time and facilities that are going to make it easier for you to serve foster youth. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. And this is where I'm going to change gears, and I'm going to start talking about some of the specific things that you can do with data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you two different snapshots, and these are two hypothetical colleges. And we're pulling the kinds of data that are readily available now through CalPAS Plus, but these are also data fields that might be available to folks in other states, or folks who are not yet participating in CalPAS Plus here in California. So what you can see for this first one, what I want to show you is how you can use data to better understand the whole pipeline or trajectory of the student's experience. So as I mentioned earlier, often when we don't have access to information, or we're just in our individual classroom or counseling office, we don't really know what happened to students before they came to us or what happens to them after they leave us. And so I'm going to show you some of the data points that you can string together so you can understand that whole experience that a student goes through, and then where you are fitting into that process and what you can do to support them. And we're going to look at roles that a number of different players can take, whether they're student services providers or K-12 districts, or if they're community colleges or 4 years. So let's take a look at what we've got for the metrics that are available in this first snapshot for College X. So we've got a cluster of information that's really looking at college readiness. So whether students end up taking remedial math, English, or English as a second language, how many students go on to be able to take a college level course in either math or English. And these could be students that either go directly into college level or make it into college level after they go through that remedial sequence. And then we have a couple of items that look at the kinds of support that those students are getting. So we can look at whether those students get financial aid, as well as whether they have an educational plan as proxies for counseling services. And then we can look at some of the pathways once they're in college, so whether they're going into career and technical education as opposed into a general education approach, general ed usually leading on then to transfer to a four-year institution or getting a general associate's degree as opposed to maybe a certificate in a workforce-related field. We can also look at degree attainment. And then you can also get this other metric, which is one that's a hybrid. This one might be harder for folks to track who don't have access to an entity like CalPass, which is the time that elapses. So if a student finishes high school, how soon, how many of them are able to enroll in college within a year? So you can see that there's a picture that you can get from this college from all these different data points. So I want to break it down and show how you can use this information. So go ahead and advance to the next slide. And we're going to start with the question of college readiness. So let's take a look at the specific figures that we've got. What you're seeing here is that about 3/4 of the students coming in are having to take some sort of remedial math, English, or ESL, meaning that they were flagged as being not ready for college. And then you see that there's a relatively small number of students that ever make it to the college level course. And it's sort of pretty close to equally bad in both math and English, where you've got around 1/4 or less that are making it into that college level course. And one of the reasons it's really important to look at that is that if you can't pass this benchmark, then your odds of being able to complete an associate's degree or to transfer are virtually nothing, because these are requirements to get to those goals. So that's what you can see when you look at these specific data points. Now, as I mentioned earlier, just the fact that you can see this doesn't give you the answer. You don't immediately know what it is you're supposed to do. So you can start asking some of those additional questions that might get you looking at possible answers. So one of the things that's becoming increasingly apparent when we're looking at this question of college readiness is the role of the test that students take when they start community college. This is also something that would be implicit in there if someone was applying directly to a four-year institution. So if students can't pass this assessment test that happens at the beginning of a community college career, then they're going to be sent into basic skills or developmental education. They're going to have to go through a series of courses. And most students who get assigned to those courses never make it out of that sequence. They never pass the college level course. So this is a pretty critical issue. Being able to pass this test may be one of the biggest indicators of whether students are going to make it to some sort of degree. And we know that that's important because there's a huge correlation between having some sort of college credential and being able to make a living wage, which is going to be of high concern to anyone working with foster youth because they have so few other resources to fall back on. So for a social service agency, what you might want to do is say, okay, so if the assessment test is a really big deal and it looks like a lot of our students can't pass that test, maybe one of the things that we could do is work intensively with foster youth to help them understand how important this test is and giving them help in preparing for it. Because if they can pass it, they're going to leapfrog right to that college level course and they're going to be much more likely to make it to some sort of degree. Now, high schools might look at these same data points and take away a different thought. So one of the questions might be, why in the world are so many of our students, especially if they're graduating as proficient, getting to college and then being told that somehow that they aren't college ready after all? So high schools might want to reach out to their community college or their four-year partners and say, what is it that you are expecting, and especially in this moment when high schools are adapting the Common Core standards, this is a really great opportunity to be having intersegmental conversations about what the expectations are so we make sure that we're teaching the students what they need to be able to make it in a college environment. And finally, colleges might say, similar to social service agencies, that they really need to be looking at these test prep opportunities. They might want to partner with the social service agencies to help prepare for the tests. Similarly, they might end up partnering with the high schools to work on curriculum. So you can see how each role has a different takeaway. So go ahead and move to the next slide. So the next place we're going to take a closer look is in the question of financial support. So what we're seeing from these numbers is that a lot of students are not successful at getting financial aid. So we've got less than 40% who are able to do so. But we do have a lot of students who are able to get an educational plan, which means they're probably meeting with a counselor and laying out a trajectory of the courses they're going to take. The other thing that's really interesting in this data is that there are very few students that are making it directly from high school into college. It's only like basically less than a third of them are making it right away. So that's an important gap that might affect students' ability to make it to some sort of degree. So one of the things that you could look at is saying, okay, clearly there's a strong counseling system in place because of all the educational plans. How can we make sure that students are getting better financial supports? And does some of this information actually have to be shared back in high school, which, as you know, since FAFSA has to be filled out in the spring, might be really important for students to be able to go straight through. So a social service agency might look at these data and say, all right, so it looks like the students don't necessarily understand what all their financial aid options are, and perhaps it's a contributing factor to their not making it straight into college. So social service agencies could do work on helping students identify financial aid options and to prepare for them. High schools might decide that they want to go ahead and have those students fill out the FAFSA in high school so that they could make sure they'd make it into college right away. Whereas the colleges might look at this and say, okay, so how can we improve those ed planning sessions? Is there a way that we could pair it with financial aid advising so students are getting access to these services right away? And as all these cases sort of demonstrate, you might look at that number, say like 39% are getting financial aid, and that might lead to questions that you would ask about why are only 39% getting financial aid. So you might go directly and talk to students about it. You might go to your high school partners and ask them what are they doing to support FAFSA completion. You might go to your financial aid office and ask what's going on in this process of counseling that financial aid appears to not be something that students are successful in attaining. So there's a lot of different ways, again, you can go through that inquiry process. So let's go on to the next slide. And I'm going to give you a third way to look at that set of data, which has to do with this question of programs of study. So these three metrics show us, again, that a lot of these students have a pretty clear educational plan, but relatively few of them are going into career and technical education. And one of the reasons that this is important for foster youth is that if you look at information on earnings gains based on CTE-related courses of study versus general education courses of study, people are much more likely to make a living wage and make a living wage quickly if they're in career and technical education. And so this might be something, a counseling option that you might want to talk to students about if getting sort of a financial floor in place is really critical to their ability to continue their education. The other thing that we can see from these data is that less than a third of students are actually making it to completion. They're not getting a certificate or a degree. So we've got a disconnect between students that are really clear on what they want to do and whether they're actually making it there. So there's a number of questions that different people might want to ask of themselves and of their students related to this. So for social service agencies, if part of what you're trying to do is just make sure that that student is going to be able to support themselves, they're going to have enough money to be able to make it, especially once they get past the financial aid era, what you might want to do is talk to students about stackable certificates that they could take in career and technical education that can help them, get the beginning of a career. And that doesn't have to mean tracking, because there's a lot of careers where you can start with smaller stackable certificates that then can be parlayed into going on to getting a 2-year or a 4-year degree or beyond. And so this might be something that would be a priority for you to let them know about. For high schools, one of the things that you might want to look at in this is what's happening where we've got students that appear directed when they come in, but they don't make it. So what is it that we could do to help prepare foster youth to persist better once they make it to college? And this is really going to require a pretty extensive dialogue with your college partners to understand what's happening to students once they get to college that you have any control over supporting. And finally, for colleges, what you might want to do is say, wow, that's really interesting. Do we have any idea what happens to students in between, if your high school partner is asking you that question? And so what you might want to do is go in and look at other data that you have available to figure out when students are dropping out. So you can look at things like term-to-term retention, which measures sort of like a student was there in the fall, did they come back in the spring, where you can figure out what are the dropout points. It could be that those students are being overwhelmingly assigned to the lowest levels of remedial English and math, and they're getting discouraged and they're dropping out. There's a lot of evidence that points to that happening. So this is a place where you're going to want to do more research, but then you might be able to figure out where the problem is and focus your intervention there. All right, So go ahead and advance the slide. So that was one example where you're really looking at the student's entire journey through different segments. So I want to sort of change gears and look at a different snapshot at a question of how you could grow a success. And I really wanted to do this because, again, it's so easy when you look at data to only focus on the negative. And for any of you that have ever gone on Rate My Professor or read an evaluation of a training that you provided, we all know that we tend to immediately go to the most negative comment and focus there and maybe ignore the 15 comments that said that this interaction was actually quite helpful for them. So what I want to do is point you to how you can look at data to find the positive story and find ways to build on what you're already doing and make it even more successful. So here we've got, again, that same suite of metrics, and you can tell that this is a pretty different picture than the last college that we looked at, and we're going to take a deeper dive in. So if you advance the slide, I'm going to look at the same 3 suites of metrics for College Y. So let's take a look at these figures. So here we're seeing that this college has a much lower rate of students that have to take basic skills. Less than half of them are being assigned to remediation. And this is actually a pretty remarkable number because we know that most colleges are assigning between 60 and 80% of their students into some sort of basic skills course. From these, you see that we still have a pretty low number of students that are making it to college level math, so less than a third. But you're seeing a really strong success rate for students making it to college level English. Almost 2/3 of students are making it there. So this could lead you to a number of questions. One thing that a social service agency could do is say, okay, how could we partner with SYS or K-12 districts and colleges to expand college preparatory offerings? Because although 44% is a lot better than the other college, you still might want to do better than that. And one of the things that you could do is you could look at where you're being so much more successful than the average college and not getting students into remediation, and then figure out how you could expand that to make that number even lower. Then high schools could take a look at this and say, well, clearly we're doing something that's working quite well in English. So let's take a look at it, understand why that's so effective, and then say, are there lessons here that we could share with the math programs so that we could build on what we already know is working. And for colleges, clearly there's this issue of that students are going into remediation, but they're not necessarily making it to the college level math class. So what they might want to do is take a look at where are they seeing foster youth making it to college level math most effectively, and then how can you build on those practices. So it doesn't just have to be math. Go look at your more successful English partners. You can also look within the math program, see where there's places that things seem to be working better, and then work to expand those opportunities. So let's move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about financial support. So here we've got a college that's doing a great job at getting into students into financial aid. More than 3/4 of students are getting it. But we've once again got the same big gap where only 18% of students are making it from high school to college within a year. So this is sort of interesting. It does indicate that whatever's happening on the counseling side of that college, they're being really effective. So even though there's a gap, they're able to get a lot of support into those students and make sure that they have the financial foundation they need to be able to focus on their studies. So social services in high schools might want to really focus in on this question of whether they need to do more work to help foster youth get financial aid while they're still in high school so they don't experience that gap year. They can look to see if that's a factor. They can talk to students. They can talk to each other about what they're observing among their students and clients. And then they can figure out, all right, so any place that we're seeing a strong connection with financial aid, a strong connection with students being able to make it straight from high school into college, what can we do more of there? How can we reward what's working? And then for the colleges, it would be really good to take a look at what they're doing about financial aid advising, because they might have some really effective practices that they can share back with the social services agencies in the high schools, and they can also think about ways to get that number even higher. Are there other ways that they can build on this success and maybe even expand it beyond? If this is a program that's just being really effective at getting to foster youth, could that be realizable for the more general population? So let's move on and look at the last data point, which is programs of study. So here we see that, again, you've got a pretty strong number of students getting an ed plan, so we're about 2/3. You've got, at this college, very few students are going into career and technical education, but we've got some really strong attainment rates for degrees or certificates, and these are higher than the average at 57%. So there's a lot of ways that you could look at this to guide your programming in the future. So one of the things that you might say is, does there appear to be a link between having the education plan and going on and getting that degree or certificate? Is it helping students get that focus, and maybe there's support that's built into it where they're refreshing their ed plan? If that's something that's really working, is there a way you could bring that lesson back to the high schools and partner with your social service agencies in your high schools to start some of that ed planning earlier? Because when you do that, especially because we know that this is a college where there's a big gap between students leaving high school and starting this college, that maybe that ed plan is going to be something that's going to be a major motivating factor for that foster youth to enroll straight in college, because they'll understand what it is that's going to be asked of them and what they're going to get to do as a result of enrolling directly. And then for the colleges, you might want to dig a little bit deeper to say, okay, if our overall success rate, our completion rate is 57% for these students, let's disaggregate that a little bit. Let's figure out, are there particular programs that have really strong completion rates and others that have low completion rates? Let's take a look at those programs that are being really successful and how they're structured, and maybe we'll have some ideas there that we could bring to the programs that are less successful. Similarly, you could go to the programs with lower completion rates, understand the kinds of challenges that they're experiencing, and then reach out to your partners, whether it's within the college or back with the social service agencies and the high schools, to figure out how you could put things in place that are going to address those problems that the practitioners are identifying. So hopefully those deep dives into these different sets of data give you an idea about how you would move forward on this. So having said that, I want to move on to this question of really what you do when you've got your data, and some of the common things that I've seen show up when practitioners are really in there and working with their information. So the first thing, and I think this is just foundational, is that you need to understand where your data are coming from. So if I'm ever in a setting where I'm bringing information forward to practitioners, the first thing people are going to say is, where did you get this number? Which students were included when you counted, and how are you defining success? Now, I actually feel like this is one of the most exciting developments that I've seen in the last 5 years around the use of data. So, you know, a couple of years ago, I might go out with data and people would just sort of look puzzled and concerned. And now I just see this incredible hunger and facility with data. People just, they're ready to engage, and they want to do so as an informed consumer of that information. So don't go into a meeting without thinking about that eventuality. And if at all possible, I think it's really helpful to have someone who really understands the data and how it was derived, who can be in a meeting with you if you're sharing data with people, so that you can answer those questions. And that way, people will understand if maybe a critical part of the population they serve wasn't counted in the metric, or might be confident that the way you defined that data element is really going to help them answer the questions that they have. So let's go on to the next slide. So this next issue is one that I alluded to earlier, is that you're going to want to immediately try to identify any data collection problems that you have. So there's a real-life example that came out of the California community colleges, in which we started tracking how students did in developmental education or basic skills. And we were cutting it based on the sort of where students started. So we said if a student started 1 level below college ready, how likely were they to succeed, or 2 levels below or 3 levels below. And this was one of these cases where data had been sort of flagged and collected, but it hadn't been looked at very clearly. So when colleges were asked to report this information to the chancellor's office, we started seeing some really weird trends in the numbers. So for example, in some colleges, students that were 3 levels below were way more successful than students that were 2 or 1 level below. And when you talk to faculty or folks on the ground, everyone was like, wait a second, that's not true. We know that's not the reality that's happening at our institution. So rather than get intimidated by that, this is your opportunity to go in there and figure out if you've got something as simple as a data entry flag that's been inappropriately assigned or a code that's been assigned to a program that's wrong. And so what you want to do is you'll look at your numbers, and I've been looking at some of the dashboards that CalPATS Plus has been creating in a number of contexts. And there's one case where I've been looking at things like the number of students who get financial aid, and all of a sudden you'll see like in 11, 12, 40% of students had financial aid, and in 12, 13, no students had financial aid. Well, those are going to be pretty clear because you're going to look at it and you're going to say the odds that we had no students on financial aid are 0. So clearly we had a problem with how this data either got flagged or uploaded. In other cases, it's going to be a little less clear. So you might look at the number of completions, and the number may be, going way, way down, and you'll find yourself asking, is that really what's happening, or are we having a problem with the data? So what you'll need to do if you're seeing problems in the data is to go back and understand how that information gets coded and collected. And so that means you're going to have to partner with your institutional research or your IT offices, whoever it is that's managing these information systems, so that you can figure it out. And this might be a place where you might want to bring cookies to these folks to make clear that you're not there to attack them either, that you're going to be their data partners to help figure out this information, because you as a practitioner may be better equipped to do so than anybody else. So this is one of those places where you get to bridge the silos and move data from a weapon to a tool. So let's go on to the next item. And this is just this issue of what happens when people who have not had access to data suddenly are given information, and often a wealth of information about what's going on with students. So sometimes you'll be maybe have been having a conversation about what's going on, and then you're given these numbers, and it's just shocking because you didn't realize it was a particular way. So I'm going to give another example out of developmental education here in California, which was that the Chancellor's Office built a tool that allowed colleges to see those success levels of how many students who were 3 levels below succeeded in those courses and how many of them made it all the way up to pass the college level course. And there's been a pretty robust debate going on about problems with the developmental sequence. But when those numbers got put up, it was like a slap in the face to a lot of practitioners. Because when you looked at rates, particularly those students that were 3 levels below, and you disaggregated that information, so you looked and saw that disproportionately African Americans and Latinos were ending up in those lowest levels of developmental education, and then almost none of them were making it through the college level course. So when you saw that there were like 9 African American students that made it to the college level course at your institution, that is a hard reality to face. And it can be a little bit shocking. So when you have people that are confronting numbers that may be difficult for them to take in, or maybe challenging something that they thought they knew about their programs, rather than sort of defending the data or defending the position of what has been done in the past, it's really helpful to take some time to explore why there's this gap between perception and what's in the data set. So again, this may be an issue where there's a data entry problem, but it also just may be that things aren't the way we realized they were. So that's where you're going to start saying, well, okay, what information have I based my assumptions on, and where am I getting this information? And then going back and doing some more of that exploring to just figure out, okay, if my understanding is so different, can I talk to other people that might help shed light on why there's such a big gap between my perception and what I'm seeing in this data point? So let's go on to the next item. And that's really this next point, that you need to go straight to the source. So when you have an assumption and you're trying to understand whether it's true, or you see a data point and it really surprises you, you really want to go talk to other people and not just sit there alone with that number. So I always believe that one of the most important things that we can do is go straight to the people that we're serving and ask them. So I see that there's like nobody's making it through from high school straight to college. What's happening here? What are the problems that you're facing? Or if you have an idea that what you need to do is really improve FAFSA completion, then run that idea by those students and say, okay, so if we could help you fill out financial aid so you would have it when you started college, would that make the difference? And that's going to make the process more effective. The second thing you're going to want to do is make sure you're talking to both your partners, internal and external, that are going to help you figure out what needs to get done, because they may have insights about how to build a more effective program that you may not have. So those financial aid staff may be your best allies in understanding how to improve things, or the faculty who work most directly with those students. And finally, you need to get out to those external partners, maybe the social service agencies, the folks that are understanding the larger context that these students are living in. Let's go on to the next one. I think one of the things that's really important also is just to not get discouraged. So even though the numbers might be daunting, remember to look at the bright spots and not just the bad things. And then figure out what it is that you can make a difference on. So you'll be getting a lot of data that might show you a lot of different problems, but you can go ahead and go in there and say, all right, I may not be able to affect all of these things, but here's something that I think I can make a difference on. And if you start with a place where you have some locus of control, whether you're a faculty member or a counselor or the director of a program or the president of a college, what you can do is just narrow in, pick something specific, and then go for the quick win. And I think that it's really important, especially when we're looking at such difficult numbers for these students' abilities to make it through our educational institutions, being able to get a success and build on it and show how data helped you get to a resolution, to get to an answer, might be really helpful as you're building familiarity with using data to drive decision making. All right, so the next slide is going to give you an idea of one way that you could go about that process of picking a discrete area of focus. And I've seen this used in a lot of different contexts. And what you do is you literally just make a map. So the first thing you do is you draw a map of what your student experiences when they're trying to make it, from their starting point in high school all the way out to getting a job. And so you just imagine yourself as a student and you plot their journey. And then wherever you have a data point, you go ahead and you mark it on that pathway. So you can sort of figure out what it is that you might be tracking. Then having done that, you're going to turn around and you're going to make a second map. And this one's going to be the ideal pathway. Like in your best case scenario, how would a student go from being in high school to having a living wage job? And the way you do that is you go backwards. You start from the successful outcome and you say, okay, what would have to be in place for the student to get to this point? And what can be really helpful about this is that you may suddenly encounter things like sequencing problems. So I've seen people do this when they're looking at that process of matriculation when students first enter community college, where they're looking at, they come in and they do the application, and then we have them do their assessment for developmental education, we develop their ed plan, and then we have them do financial aid. And then they'll realize, oh my gosh, we actually have to do the financial aid first, because that may be what is the ultimate decider of whether the student gets to be in higher education. So when you do that, then you can sort of understand where the gaps are between the ideal case and your current scenario, and you can say, here are places where I think that we could make a big difference, and then you can identify your partners and say, okay, if we really need to move FAFSA completion back to the K-12, then we definitely have to partner with them, and this might be a great place to add the social service agencies in because they can also provide this advising earlier on. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. The next thing that I really want to encourage you to do is to make data your ally. Again, I mentioned earlier that there's sort of this perception often that data is a weapon that gets used against practitioners. But I really believe that data can be one of the most powerful tools that practitioners can use to advocate for the students they're trying to serve. So the first thing you can do is you can help decision makers understand the scale of the problem. So when developmental education faculty saw that 9 African American students were making it to college level math or English, that is such a powerful advocacy tool where you can say, look, this is how bad the problem is. Sitting with the status quo is not going to work. We have to find some way to address this issue. The second thing that I've seen that's been really effective is to be able to pair these incredible stories that most practitioners have about individual students and what happened to them and what worked for them and what they attained or didn't. And then you can tie that to some hard numbers. So you can tell the story of the student that came and they were a B-level student in math, and then they got assessed as basic skills and they tried for 3 years to make it through the developmental sequence and they never made it. And you can say, this isn't one student. This is 92% of the students that we're serving. And that can be really powerful in making the case for the changes you might want to make. And finally, it really enables you to bring those equity issues to the forefront. And you can show that, particularly like if you compare foster youth to other types of students, that there is a difference in the outcomes that these students experience. There's a difference in the resources they have access to. And keeping that equity agenda like this front and center can make a really big difference, particularly because I think there's a lot of conversation going on right now about how we're going to sort of balance these focuses on both access and success. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is my final point. It's just really important to remember with data that you are not alone. So you should use data as a bridge building tool. And some of the just like basic questions you can ask yourself is that when you're looking at your data and you have things that are just leaping out at you, like the number of students who have more than a year between when they enroll in high school and they go to college, you can ask yourself, so who else is going to be motivated to take action on these kinds of numbers? Who else is really going to care about that? And who else can help me try to tackle that problem? And then once you're sort of thinking about that, you can ask yourself, so what issues do I have in common with these potential partners that would make it easy for us to sort of bring our efforts together and leverage each other's strengths and leverage each other's knowledge to end up providing a more comprehensive support for the people that we really want to make a difference for, which are those foster youth. So the final slides that I'm going to leave you with are a couple of resources that you can use if you're interested in using data to inform your decision making. So the first is, again, that link to where you can get information out of CalPAS Plus if you're a California-based community college for your institution or K-12 district. And there's the link there for that webinar that was offered earlier on getting to good data. And then I wanted to share with you a URL here for a website that WestEd built, which just has dozens of tools that are intended to help practitioners use data for decision making. So you can use that if you want to start facilitating conversations with your partners or within your institution, and this will give you a lot of practical tips that you can use. And finally, we've got Debbie's email address here, who's available to provide additional support. So that sort of completes my presentation. I don't know if there are any questions that have come up through the chat window that I can help answer.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. So as a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to use the question window on your control panel to go ahead and send those over to us. We do have a little bit of time for just a few questions. So first is actually somebody sent in a clarification from something that was said early on in the web seminar about the community college assessment test process. Kathy, I know you're aware of sort of the fact that this test is not just a pass-fail, but is more of a placement indicator. So just for those who aren't as familiar, can you say a couple words about how that placement test works?
Absolutely. So California is a multiple measure state, which means that colleges are going to be looking at a couple of different metrics that help determine whether a student is ready for college. But the bottom line is that most institutions are looking primarily at the score on a standardized test that looks at student skills in particularly math and English. And so there are cases where the student's ability to pass that test makes a really big difference in where they end up getting placed. Every college is different with how they do the placement process, and there are many colleges that have attended quite carefully to trying to come up with additional ways to support it. But there's been a lot of research that indicates that I think what's most important is that African American and Latinos are disproportionately placed 3 levels below by these tests. And so since that's a population that overlaps pretty heavily with foster youth, this could have a really big impact. And so if a college is trying to figure out how they want to assess students, they might want to be looking carefully at this test, whether it's making sure that students really understand how important it is to take, whether they've had the chance to prep, if they need to brush up on quadratic equations, and there's a number of colleges that have really focused on the test prep component, and there's other places that have tried looking at other metrics and weighing them more heavily.
Great. The next question I'm going to go ahead and answer, which is Again, from the very beginning when I was talking about the CalPAS Plus system, there's a question about whether community colleges can also submit a cohort foster youth file. The answer is yes. So if you have a campus support program and you want to pull data specifically for those who participate in that program or some other subset, you can provide a list of those students through CalPAS Plus if you're at a community college, and also if you're at a four-year that participates in CalPAS Plus, and be able to pull that data. So the next question for you, Kathy, is somebody's raising the issue of that ideally it'd be great if foster youth, when they're within the child welfare system, were only in one home and one placement and had that kind of level of stability in their lives so that they didn't fall behind in terms of their educational attainment during K-12. And so could you say a little bit more about, the question is, how can we use this data to facilitate that communication with the child welfare agency before young people get to college?
So I think that one of the problems that we're facing is what kind of data are getting collected and how well various data systems talk to each other. So if child welfare agencies have information on whether students are getting to have a stable placement or if they're bouncing between families, that might be a point that you'd want to sort of look at in comparison to the educational attainment data, where you'd say, what is the educational attainment of students who get to stay in one family and those who don't? The problem is getting the ability to share that information with each other, which can be fairly complicated. So right now, what CalPAS Plus has done is it's brought together K-12 data and community college data and four-year data and been able to make a match, so we can say, this is the same student that was a B student in high school, and this is what that same student did once they got to community college. Did they complete the ed plan? Things like that. It's going to be trickier as we're trying to integrate things like information that's in social service agencies. So for people that are part of grants where they're sharing data with each other, if you can find a way to see if it's the same students, then you're going to have a much more powerful conversation. But the issue is that the legality of those data sharing agreements and whether you have permission to share it, and that's a much more complex issue.
Great. So the next question is from a campus, and the question is, program administrators might have had unpleasant experiences when they tried to use data in the past, leading to current resistance to data use. So it seems like you really need to foster a culture of inquiry within programs. How can we best accomplish that?
Well, I think that the first thing you do is you create a protected space where people can look at their data and not be punished for it. I think one of the hardest things about getting an inquiry process started is making it possible for people to look at success as well as failure and have it not be seen as a sign of their success or failure. I mean, there's a lot of factors that are going to influence student success, and with foster youth, I feel like that's particularly acute, the things that happen outside of the educational context. So creating an environment where you say, we get to look at the data and nobody gets blamed, and we get to be curious and ask questions of each other, that's what makes the biggest difference. And there's been such a strong movement for faculty inquiry, and it's very robust in K-12. There's been a lot of great examples here in California that I can think of, where you just want to sort of go in and build that environment. You might also want to look at the WestEd site. I think they've got some tools that might give you ideas for how to facilitate those conversations, but that safe, protected space is probably the first and best thing that you can do.
Great. So I'm just going to answer one last question that we've got in, which is there a way we can replay this webinar at a later time? The answer to that is yes. This web seminar was recorded, and we will post that on the California College Pathways website within the next 2 days. So if you go to that website that's listed on the screen, cacollegepathways.org, at the very top of the homepage, there's a link that says training materials, and you can go there, and that will take you to all of the various web seminars that we've delivered through California College Pathways, including this one, as well as the previous data web seminar that was done last month. I think that's about all we have time for right now. We're at our time here at 11 o'clock. So I want to say a huge, huge thank you to Kathy Booth for such a wonderful job presenting this information. If folks have other questions, please feel free to email me. My information is there on the screen. And thank you all for your participation this morning. And that concludes this morning's web seminar.